But that idea that the Fortune 500 would be running the world in a much more real way than the UN 190, is that simply dormant until the heat dies down? Or did we really have a wake-up call from the global financial crisis that made people rethink that idea?
Well, let's put it this way. There are reasons for some humility, are there not? And maybe, there's no doubt, and that's why it's important to bring multinationals and corporations generally into a mainstream of understanding their responsibility. That in the 21st century, corporations do matter, as governments matter, and we need more public-private, broad-based partnerships with civil society, etc., on addressing issues. I'm going back to Ireland now. I have a foundation there on climate justice. We don't want to have a conversation necessarily about that, but it is, to me, one of the other challenges of a human rights nature that we need to be addressing, and the private sector will be vital in this challenge, because the lifestyles that we're enjoying in this part of the world have contributed to the greenhouse gas emissions that are undermining the daily life of many, many poor people in the world. I was in Liberia recently. It's the subject of conversation. If you go to any poor country in Africa, any country in Africa at the moment, the climate changes are huge and are undermining planning of when a farmer will sow. They're undermining subsistence farmers. They're undermining women in the poorest communities. It's a huge, real issue. And there is that particular responsibility that it's arising from the fossil fuel-based growth that we have benefited from. And how do we square that? I think we're going to have new ways of realizing that it's only by providing the poorest with what they are entitled to under international human rights, a right to development that is as low carbon based as it can be, but they have a right to development anyway, and they are the majority world, and we're going to have a huge increase in population. So we need the private sector to be thinking of ways of bringing to scale affordable renewable energies for the poorest. That's an immediate, urgent problem, and it cannot be solved by governments. It has to be solved with the private sector, with a responsible private sector.
But doesn't it always also put the private sector on a collision course with government? In Copenhagen, there were as many corporate representatives as governmental ones running around trying to catch the ear of people with microphones like me. And I saw a definite desire not to want hard and fast deadlines, hard and fast targets, commitments, regulation, the very thing that may be the only way you're going to get limitations on future emissions.
I agree, and I think for those of us who were there, Copenhagen was disappointing, and so far the road to Cancun is disappointing in wanting real commitments. I suppose if we're talking about business and human rights, we have to talk about lobbies. And there are two things that worry me about this country. One is the strength of the fossil fuel lobby and the way in which it is seeking to undermine and deny what is happening to our world. This isn't a trade dispute or a trade negotiation issue in Copenhagen or in Cancun. It's about the future of the world. And it's about following the science. It's about understanding the huge and very real challenge that's facing us. I mean, I usually talk about it in personal terms because that's where I can make sense of it. You know, I'm a grandmother with 4 grandchildren who will be in their 40s in 2050. And I have no confidence, looking at the science, that they will have a livable world. It's a world where we're told there'll be something like 200 million climate refugees, where parts of the world will be unlivable, where, you know, and if we go substantially above the 2 degrees Celsius and 450 parts per million that we're warned to stay below, and hopefully even stay below 1.5 degrees. Islands will go under, Bangladesh and other countries will be largely covered with water. The implications are huge, and yet there's a very effective lobby undermining the credibility of the science in this country. And now, sadly, because of the Supreme Court, there's money wafting around of huge proportions that is undermining so much of what needs to be very clearly and honestly stated. You need to cleanse your politics in a way to face some of these very real issues. There's a huge need for leadership which understands that, especially on the climate issue, you cannot play around with the science. It's inexorable. It's like mathematics. You have to go with it, and you have to safeguard future generations. And we need somehow to stem the awful lobbying that's buying research and muddying the waters. And again, I come back to the transparency that resource centres can try and introduce here. But the challenges are getting worse in some of the corporate lobbying that's going on. And I think we need to address that.
Let me point out that there are microphones both in the left and right aisle, about 2/3 of the way up the stairs. If you want to ask Mary Robinson a question, please come to the mics, and we'll get to as many questions as we can.
I wouldn't mind a few questions from the floor.
Ends.
This guy's getting tougher and tougher.
You were born out of a very old culture in a very new country. Just a few decades from civil war, a very socially conservative country, one that probably when you were born couldn't imagine that there'd be a woman president a relatively short time later in historical terms. I don't want you to get carried away with yourself, and you don't have a tendency to do that, but do you sometimes think about the arc of your life, about the country that you're going home to right now compared to the one that you were born in?
Well, I have brothers who constantly remind me, and we have a phrase in the family, and it's called "long way from Miss Ruddy's." The school I went to in Ballina was a school with one teacher, and I couldn't believe it when I went back and saw her after I'd left the school for a few years, how small she was, because she scared the wits out of us. She was ferocious, and she had a cane. And I have to say, when I was in Miss Ruddy's, I never thought, life would be as it is. I think I've been extraordinarily lucky, and it's time maybe to say that, I do get a lot of recognition and plaudits, etc., and I know full well that you only really get to any of the achievements that I've been fortunate enough to get to with the help of an enormous number of people, family, friends, workmates, my colleagues in Realising Rights. We're coming to this planned end after 5 years, and you would think when you plan a planned end 5 years ago that it would be a smooth down to the 17th of December. 14th of December we have a big party, which I hope most people will come to. But instead of that, my colleagues have decided now is the time to really bring together the work of 8 years and bring it to fruition. So instead of it being like this, it's like, on the 14th of December we will, as I said, I sat in that office of the Ministry of Labour in Liberia. I have not been doing this work on decent work. And I was just amazed to hear this minister talk about the fact that a small human rights organization was so strategic in their planning, so strategic. And it's why I really want human rights organizations to begin to be part of this development paradigm, where we do bring the tools of human rights to hold to account, but we also can be flexible and witty and there when it matters, and help countries, and actually help countries to stand up to some of the donor mentality that feels a poor country can't afford to have decent work standards. It's got to have bottom of the pyramid standards. No, it hasn't. Decent work is for poor countries as well, and we need to really stand up to the philosophy.